Maya Gavan and Melanin Amenik Swilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to another video in our Lords of Beleriand First Age Silmarillion series. So in this video I'm going to continue the story of the coming of men in Tolkien's Legendarium, and I'm going to focus specifically on the three houses of the Edain, the elf friends, the Sindarin-speaking men of Beleriand. Now, in the last video, I introduced the House of Beor, led by a man called Beor, and I talked about their incredible interaction with Lord Finrod Felagund of the Noldor, the first named elf ever to meet a mortal man. And so, in this video, I'm going to begin by continuing their tale and explaining how the House of Beor came to settle in their new home. So, as you'll remember from last time, the House of Beor developed an intense friendship and an intense loyalty with Finrod Felagund, and they take him for their lord and kind of like their ambassador in introducing them to the rest of Beleriand and its peoples. And the first new peoples that this clan of men encounter are the Lyaquendi of Osiriand, the green elves, basically wood elves, the most lightly armed and the least wise elves in Beleriand. And the green elves were troubled by the coming of men. They saw the newcomers as fellers of trees and breakers of peace and unfriends. And for a while, the green elves saw the House of Beor simply as trespassers in their woods. But the green elves heard that a lord of the Eldar was among them, i.e. Finrod, and so they went to him, and they told him that if the newcomers did not depart their lands, we shall afflict them in all the ways that we can. Which is not very welcoming, to be honest, but I think that Finrod demonstrates an admirable amount of grace here, because instead of arguing with the green elves, he recognizes that, to be fair, this is their land, and Beleriand is huge, and for the most part, it's empty. So there's plenty of space where the House of Beor can safely set up a settlement far away from the afflictions of the uppity green elves. So, under the guidance of Finrod, the House of Beor moved northward, and they eventually came to dwell in an area called Estolad. And Estolad is actually the land belonging to the youngest sons of Feanor. So, almost overnight, the new race of men become a fascinating curiosity among most of the elves in Beleriand. We are told that both Noldor and Sindar journeyed to Estolad, being eager to see the Edain, whose coming had long been foretold. And among these curious elves were messengers sent by Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor. Now, I'll talk a lot more about King Fingolfin later in this video. He's an important part of the story, but for now, all I'll say is that Fingolfin was incredibly welcoming to the Edain, and just like his nephew Finrod Felagund, Fingolfin kind of adopts one of the houses and he takes them under his wing. Although, interestingly, not all of the Elven kings are quite so lovely. You'll notice that Estolad is very close to Elu-Thingol Sindar Kingdom of Doriath, and so just as the Lords of the Noldor become aware of the coming of men, so too does Thingol. But, unfortunately, none of the Noldor, except Finrod, seek Thingol's counsel or communicate with him at all on the issue. And so Thingol takes a bit of a haughtier approach to the coming of men. He decrees that they are only allowed to take up residence in the north and only within realms that are already ruled by Noldorine princes, whom he holds accountable for the actions of the men in their domain. And Thingol also explicitly states that absolutely no men are ever allowed to come within the border of his kingdom of Doriath. But what makes this so interesting is that Thingol's wife, Mellyn the Maya, kind of silently calls her husband's bluff here. So she doesn't say anything, not to Thingol, but she does later tell her star pupil Galadriel that one of men shall indeed come. She even says that her magical boundary, the Girdle of Mellyn, won't be able to keep him out. A power greater than her own shall drive him, and his fate will forever change the history of Middle-earth. But that's just a cheeky little bit of foreshadowing. Back to the House of Beor, they spend about a year in Estolad, and in that time they meet men of the other two houses, and for that full year, Finrod stays with them, teaching and ennobling them. But eventually, Finrod does reckon that he probably ought to return to his realm of Nargothrond, which is on the other side of Beleriand. Like, I guess from the perspective of his people, he just sort of set off one day to go hunting with his cousins, and then he kind of got sidetracked by the coming of men for a whole year. And so in the end, Finrod does leave his new friends in Estolad, and he returns home to Nargothrond. But he doesn't go back alone. And this brings us to such a beautiful part of the story. So remember Beor, the dude, not the house? Well, he begs Finrod Felagund's permission to accompany him back to Nargothrond, and Finrod happily obliges. So Beor journeys with Finrod all the way to the secret Elven kingdom, and there he spends the next 44 years in the service of Finrod. He becomes known as Beor the Old, and we're even told that the span of his life is lengthened by spending so much time in the company of Finrod and the Eldar. However, like all mortal men, Beor must eventually die. And at the very respectable age of 93, his time eventually comes. He dies. But for the elves, this is like nothing they've ever seen before. Beor suffers no wound or grief, he simply relinquishes his life, and he passes in peace, stricken by age. It's something the elves have never known in themselves, and they grieve greatly for their friend, which is made even more profound by the fact that, unlike with deceased elves, no one knows what happens to Beor's spirit after he's gone. The fate of men is forever hidden. But although Beor does depart the story, his people do not. And among Beor's many direct descendants, there are quite a few familiar names. In fact, Beor's great-great-great-grandson has perhaps the most famous name of anyone in all the Silmarillion, Beren. Of Beren and Luthien fame, the same name that J.R.R. Tolkien has inscribed on his gravestone in real life. However, we do have a little ways to go before we get to Beren, but on the other side of the family tree, the House of Beor is now led by Beor's great-grandson, and his name is Boromir. Now, obviously, we're not talking about that Boromir, but we are talking about the guy that Boromir is named after. Actually, alright, the famous Boromir is probably named after Gondor's 11th steward, but Steward Boromir is definitely named after this Boromir, the new chieftain of the House of Beor. And the reason that this Boromir matters is because he's the one who leads his people out of Estolad, and he establishes a new home for the House of Beor in the highland forests of Dorthonion. Now, I've mentioned Dorthonion in a few previous videos, and that's because this realm is ruled by two of Finrod's younger brothers, Angrod and Aegnor. And it's here, in Dorthonion, that the House of Beor remain for the foreseeable future, mingling with the brothers of Finrod and learning much knowledge and lore from them. And, as it goes, there is one man of Beor's house, or more specifically a woman of Beor's house, who develops a particularly close bond with one of Finrod's brothers, Aegnor. Now, I've not talked much about Aegnor yet, and to be honest, he's not, the most massively important character, at least not as the princes of the Noldor go, but he does have one particularly fascinating storyline that is, for all intents and purposes, a love story. So, I know it's said that Tolkien didn't write a huge number of female characters into the Legendarium, and relative to the number of male characters, that is probably true, but of the women he does give us, so many are awesome characters, and that is particularly true of this woman, Andreth. Now, unlike, say, Eowyn, Andreth isn't much of a warrior, and she's not some almightily powerful lady like Galadriel or Melian, but she is a particularly wise and learned woman with a deep appreciation for lore and what we might call, I don't know, like metaphysics, philosophy. For although her name is Andreth, I mean that's what the House of Beor call her, the elves gave her a new name, Silmarillion, which means wise heart. And Tolkien actually tells us quite a bit about one of Andreth's philosophical debates. In Morgoth's Ring, we're given a really long and uncharacteristically complete account of Andreth's conversation with none other than Finrod Felagund. It's called the Athrabeth Finrod a Andreth, which just means the debate of Finrod and Andreth. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail, but one of the central themes of this debate is the metaphysical difference between elves and men, and especially their philosophical differences when it comes to death. Finrod and Andreth go back and forth on loads of really interesting issues, including the metaphorical wound that Morgoth left on the ancestors of all men way back in Hildorian, and how that shadow still resides in the hearts of men. That fear of death, that resentment of Eru Ilúvatar. But they also talk about hope and the nature of the body and the soul, and they talk about Ilúvatar's plan for the world, and all kinds of things that really are very compelling if you have an interest in philosophy. It certainly reads more like a philosophical essay than it does a fictional story. Anyway, the other reason that the Athrabeth is so interesting is because towards the end of it, Andreth tells Finrod about her feelings for Finrod's younger brother, Aegnor, one of the lords of Dorthonion. And this is a great little wrinkle in the Legendarium because we're told that when Aegnor and Andreth first laid eyes on each other's reflections in a lake called Ailuin, they immediately fell in love. Now, in Tolkien's writings, there are three main unions of elves and men, but if things had gone slightly differently, there could have been four. And what's so unique about the love of Andreth and Aegnor is that this is the only romantic elven union where the man is an elf and the woman is a man. In all other cases, it's a lady elf marrying a mortal male. However, sadly, Andreth and Aegnor were simply not meant to be. The timing just wasn't right. When the two lovers met, Beleriand was in the midst of a tentative ceasefire. Morgoth was locked away in Angband, but they were still very much at war. And there's an elven custom that the Noldor do not marry except in times of peace. Now, you may be thinking, well, what about Galadriel and Celeborn? They seem to have married during a time of war, and that's actually a really good point. Although it is worth noting that we're never actually given an exact date of when Galadriel and Celeborn tied the knot, so it's possible that they waited until the peace of the Second Age. It's also worth pointing out a significant difference between Celeborn and Aegnor. Although we do see Celeborn fight way later in the Third Age, his main powers seem to be in wisdom and just plain goodness, rather than military might. Until The Lord of the Rings, there's no reference to any battle that Celeborn fights in. Aegnor, on the other hand, is very much a warrior. In the Shibboleth of Feanor, we're told that he was terrible in battle with fire in his eyes. In fact, his name, what it means, is sharp flame. And alongside his brother Angrod, Aegnor is in charge of defending one of the most strategically important spots in Beleriand. Dorthonion's already come under attack in the Dagor Aglareb, and I feel like Aegnor realizes that he simply can't be the valiant warrior he's destined to be whilst taking a mortal as his wife. It's a huge sacrifice, but Aegnor makes it for the good of all peoples. And Andreth understands. I mean, she says so in the Athrabeth. But in light of their love, neither Andreth nor Aegnor ever take any other lover. They both remain unwed and childless until the end of their lives. Now, that's pretty much everything to say for now about the House of Beor. They live in Dorthonion for a long while as vassals of Andreth and Aegnor, and as devoutly loyal friends of Finrod Felagund. That'll be important in just a few videos' time. But there are two other houses of men that enter Beleriand, and both of these houses are immensely awesome too, and they definitely deserve to be talked about. So without further ado, the second kindred of men to enter Beleriand is the House of Haleth. And if you thought Andreth was a badass female character, just you wait. Haleth is a feminist icon. She's perhaps the Silmarillion's most badass warrior woman. But unlike the House of Beor, the people of Haleth do not have an easy go of it upon first arriving in Beleriand. Now, I must point out that Haleth was not actually the original leader of her house. She was not the one who brought her people to Beleriand, but she is the one that her house is named after. So, another name for the people of the House of Haleth is the Haladin, and the Haladin are quite a bit different from the other kindreds of men in Beleriand. We're told that they are shorter than the other mannish houses, and they spoke a completely unrelated language. Also, they're a pretty secretive bunch. The Haladin were considered unusual by both men and elves in that they didn't really adopt the manners or customs of other people. For the most part, they were a solitary folk who kept to themselves in their woodland homes, and unlike the other houses of the Edain, they never swore loyalty to any elven lord. However, that said, they were still excellent warriors, and they excelled particularly well in forest warfare. Now, the reason that the Haladin are known by that name is because their leader was a guy called Haldad, and Haldad was the father of Haleth. But unlike the House of Beor, who were incredibly lucky in the fact that they were first introduced to Beleriand by Finrod Felagund, the Haladin were particularly unlucky. Their first contact with the peoples of Beleriand came in the form of a secret orc warband. So, we're told that the Haladin lived in small, isolated homesteads that pretty much ruled themselves, and so they're very slow to unite. But Haldad was able to unite them, and that is thanks to Morgoth. So, Morgoth's original plan, as I believe I've said, was to corrupt the men of Beleriand and to use them as soldiers in his war against the elves. Thanks to Finrod and Beor, that did not end up happening, and so in his frustration, Morgoth sent a sneaky little orc raiding party past the watchful elven siege and down into the southeast, where they fell upon the unsuspecting Haladin, who were living peacefully in the forests of Thargelion. Now, luckily for the Haladin, Haldad was masterful and fearless, and he united all the brave warriors of his people to repel that orc attack. And he did so by building a stockade in a very strategic spot. So right here in the corner where the river Gelion meets the river Askar, Haldad set up his defences, and he removed all the non-combatants behind this stockade. Now, I've said in previous videos that orcs are particularly bad watermen. They fear rivers and lakes and seas and all the domains of Ulmo. And so their only way to get to the Haladin was to besiege this stockade. And for a long time, that's what the orcs did. Haldad and his warriors defended their people, but eventually their food began to run out. So, Haldad decided to charge out in a sortie and to tackle the orcs head on. This was incredibly brave, but unfortunately it ended real badly for Haldad. He was slain. And because orcs are just the worst things, they began to butcher and mutilate his body. So Haldad's son, Haldar, he rushed out super courageously to defend his father's body from the desecration of the enemy, and then he died too. Shock. And this brings us to Haldad's only remaining child, his daughter, Haleth. So after the deaths of Haldad and Haldar, the Haladin were in a real dire situation. In fact, we're told they'd lost all hope. Perhaps some thought the only way to survive would be to join the Dark Lord and to begin worshipping Morgoth. Others threw themselves into the river and drowned. That at least was preferable to the butchery of the orcs. But not Haleth. She was a woman of great heart and strength, and despite the hopelessness of their plight, she kept her people together, and she was valiant in their defense. So for 7 more days, Haleth defended the stockade, and she kept the orcs at bay. But eventually the forces of Morgoth broke through, and they began their final assault against the Haladin. And it was while Haleth was fiercely defending her kin that she and the orcs heard the music of elven trumpets. Finally, after who knows how long, help came to the Haladin from the north. And the guy who brought these reinforcements and broke the host of orcs was the elven lord of Thargelion, Caranthir, the 4th son of Feanor. Now you'll remember from earlier videos that Caranthir the Dark is not the friendliest elf in Middle-earth. In fact, he's kind of known for being a bit of a mean dude. He had some very negative things to say about the Sindar, and he was even pretty rude to his cousins, the children of Finarfin. Which is why I think it's so significant that Caranthir was so impressed by Haleth. When the orcs were all slain, Caranthir looked kindly upon the Haladin and did Haleth great honour. This is the same guy who Tolkien described as being the harshest of Feanor's sons and the most quick to anger. In fact, Caranthir even offers Haleth recompense for her father and brother, and he tells her that the Haladin are welcome to settle freely in his lands under his friendship and with his protection. But to this, Haleth basically says, thanks, but no thanks. As I mentioned earlier, the House of Haleth like to live independently, and they're simply unwilling to take any lord that's not one of their own. So Haleth gathered all the living Haladin together. She gathered what was left of their possessions, and she led them on a long journey through Beleriand to find their new home. And the first place that Haleth brought her people to was Estolad, the very same spot where the House of Beor had settled. And so it's here that the House of Haleth are reunited with their long-sundered kin. And they also meet the House of Hador here. In fact, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Haladin did not remain in Estolad for long, and Haleth soon led her people westward, toward the great forests that make up the heart of Beleriand. However, you guys will probably be aware that this great forest is controlled predominantly by King Eleuthingol, and everything inside his wife's magical barrier is the realm of Doriath, which men aren't allowed to enter. So Haleth leads her people on this really dangerous journey through the lands that lie between the Girdle of Mellyn and Nandon Gortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death, the very same place that Ungoliant, mother of Shelob, poisoned and defiled a few hundred years before. Tolkien even tells us that this road was no place for mortal men, and yet Haleth led her people through it anyway. Now, over time, a few of the Haladin broke away from the main group, and some of them wandered as far away as Nargothrond. But there were many who loved the Lady Haleth and wished to go whither she would, and dwell under her rule. And so, eventually, Haleth led her people here, to the forest of Brethil. Now, Brethil is a really interesting place because it's one of the 3 forests that makes up Doriath. However, the Girdle of Mellyn doesn't extend over all of Brethil, and so the Haladin find themselves in a sort of, it's an elven woodland, but it's not quite within the borders of Doriath. However, that's not to imply that Eleuthingol doesn't have anything to say about this. Of course he does. He always has something to say, and as per usual, he doesn't say the nicest thing. In fact, he pretty much denies the Haladin any right to dwell in Brethil. But, as per usual, the race of men are defended by Thingol's great-nephew, Finrod Felagund. Finrod basically explains to King Eleuthingol all the hardships that the Haladin have endured, and believe it or not, he actually convinces Thingol to change his mind. Although there is one condition. If Haleth and her people are to settle so close to the borders of Doriath, then they are charged with defending Doriath from any invasion that may come in the future, and they are to keep their part of the forest completely free of orcs. Now, upon hearing this condition, Haleth gives Eleuthingol a wonderfully sassy reply. She says, "Where are Haldad, my father, and Haldar, my brother? If the king of Doriath fears a friendship between Haleth and those who have devoured her kin, then the thoughts of the Eldar are strange to men." And with that, Haleth became the first chieftain of the woodsmen of Brethil. And I said earlier that the House of Haleth are considered unusual amongst other men, and I guess one of the most obvious ways in which they're different is that many of their warriors were women. In fact, in the Unfinished Tales, we're told that Haleth, the renowned Amazon, actually created a peaked bodyguard of women to protect her. And in the War of the Jewels, we're told that thanks to Haleth, among the Haladin, daughters and their descendants were to be eligible for election. So yeah, Haleth is an awesome woman with a really compelling story. And when she did eventually die, unmarried and childless, her people raised a green mound over her in the heights of the forest, which they called Tuatha Haretha, the Lady Barrow. So that's the origins of the House of Haleth, and after she died, the Haladin took her nephew as their new chief. And for 100 years or so, they lived as a mysterious and secretive, yet wholly independent woodland community. Which brings us finally to the third house of the Edain, the House of Hador. Now, I know I left these guys till last, but I actually think that the House of Hador is perhaps the most important of the three kindreds, or at least they're certainly the ones who have the most intimate relationship with the Noldor. So, the House of Hador is both the most numerous of the three kindreds, and, or perhaps because of that, they are also the last to enter Beleriand. But when they do arrive, they don't come as a disordered crowd. Instead, we are told that the House of Hador marched in ordered companies. They are the tallest and the most warlike of the three kindreds of men, and they also seem to be the best equipped. They came to Beleriand with horses, and donkeys, and goats, and sheep, and they arrived in 3 separate hosts, each containing 2,000 adult men. So the ancestors of the House of Hador were from the same early group that became the ancestors of the Men of the North, and during their migration through Middle-earth, they were in constant conflict with the men who'd remained under the shadow of Morgoth. So the House of Hador were no strangers to battle, and when they finally did cross the mountains into Beleriand, they were a pretty terrifying sight for the local green elves. Now, there were 2 years between Finrod's discovery of Beor's people and the coming of the House of Hador, and so when the last kindred did finally arrive in Beleriand, there were already a number of stories about other men in the region who'd settled in a green and fertile land. So, the leader of the House of Hador, he was a guy called Marach, he brought his people along the Dwarf Road, and they too eventually settled in Estolad. So now we have all 3 houses, Beor, Haleth and Hador, living together and mingling in Estolad. And I'll come back to this right at the end of this video, but although we know the House of Beor and Haleth swiftly moved on to find new homes, the House of Hador remained in Estolad for a long time. And as a result of staying for so long, they spent a good deal of that time getting to know the Elven lords of the Noldor, and most notably, the High King Fingolfin himself. So I mentioned Fingolfin earlier in this video, and you'll know that he's been a really important character throughout the story thus far. And just as Finrod kind of adopted the House of Beor under his wing, Fingolfin and his eldest son Fingon adopt the House of Hador. And eventually they bring them to dwell in Fingolfin's western realm of Heathlum. And so, it's here that the House of Hador first become fluent in the Sindarin language of the elves. Remember, they're not allowed to speak the Noldor's Quenya, that's now illegal, thanks Thingol. But anyway, in the far future of the Legendarium, when we come to places like Gondor, for example, we see that those men still take Sindarin names for themselves and for their cities. You know, Minas Tirith, Osgiliath, Denethor, these are all Sindarin names. And the reason that the Dunedain of Gondor speak Sindarin, the Dune Edain, is because they are direct descendants of the Edain of Beleriand, some of them from the House of Hador. This is the origin of that long tradition of elf friends among the race of men. We see it with the Dunedain, we see it with the Númenóreans, and we see it begin primarily right here with the House of Hador in the realm of Fingolfin. So, initially, Marach's people lived literally side by side with the elves of Fingolfin's realm, but it was eventually decided that it's probably not sustainable to just continue living that way permanently without any kind of order or structure. So Fingolfin, deciding that men needed lords of their own kind, set regions apart where men could live their own lives and appoint chieftains to hold these lands freely. Which I think is a very altruistic thing for a king to think. You certainly don't see it very often in the real world. And Fingolfin, he even goes a step further, or perhaps I should say his son Fingon does, because Fingon actually gifts his own realm, his own lands of Dor-lómin to the House of Hador. So, Dor-lómin is a place that'll come up a few more times throughout the story, but from this point on, it is a mannish community, under the protection of Fingon and Fingolfin, but independent of Elven rulership. It belongs to the House of Hador. Now, you may very well be wondering, if the leader of this house is called Marach, then why is it called the House of Hador? And that's a really good question, which brings us to a character that Tolkien called the greatest chieftain of the Edain, the great-grandson of Marach, whose name is Hador Lorindel, or Hador Goldenhead. Now, Hador may not be the most famous mannish hero of the First Age, but he is a wonderful character. He's the first named mortal ever to be given the title Elf Friend. He exclusively speaks Sindarin in his household, and he's even remembered as a peer of Elven lords. Under his leadership, the House of Hador becomes the mightiest of all the kindreds of the Edain. And when Fingon gifted him and his people the realm of Dor-lómin, he also gifted him a special dwarven helmet called the Dragon Helm of Dor-lómin, which I mentioned a few videos back in the one all about the dwarves. It was originally forged by an incredible dwarven smith whose name was Telkar. He gave it as a gift to Maedhros, who in turn gave it to his cousin Fingon, but now the Dragon Helm of Dor-lómin belongs to Hador. And the reason that this is an important artifact is because the helm will be passed down through Hador's descendants, until it becomes very important to his grandson, Húrin, and even more important to Hador's famous great-grandchildren, the children of Húrin, who you've probably heard of. And it's not just those guys who claim their descent from Hador Lorindel. If you're at all familiar with the tale of Gondolin, you probably know the name Tuor, who's also Hador's great-grandson. And even if you've never heard of him, I reckon you've at least heard of Eärendil, one of the most important names in the Silmarillion. Well, he's a direct descendant of Hador too, although he's also a direct descendant of Fingolfin on his mother's line, so Eärendil's got a lot going on. Anyway, it's not just famous descendants that make me like Hador so much. Hador's relationship with King Fingolfin is wonderfully lovely, and it lasts for the entirety of Hador's life. So although I said that the House of Hador moved to live slightly separate from Fingolfin's elves, Tolkien does tell us that many of the Edain had delight in the friendship of the elves and dwelt among them for so long as they had leave. And in the case of Hador Lorindel, Fingolfin just never stopped giving his leave. We're told that in his youth, Hador was loved by the king. And in some ways, the nature of their relationship makes me think of the way that a person and their pet dog might love each other. Now, I'm not saying that to make fun of Hador or to make fun of your love for your dog, but when a person loves their pet, it's very different from the way a person may love, I don't know, like their friends or their children or their partner. A dog will love its owner, probably not consciously knowing, but at least subconsciously trusting that the owner will be there for all of its life. But an owner loves their pet knowing that their pet's life will probably only last for a portion of theirs. And I think that's how it is with Fingolfin and Hador. Hador loved Fingolfin knowing that the Elven king would be there for every day of his life. And Fingolfin loved Hador knowing that one day he would lose him. Anyway, this has turned into quite a long video, but before I finish, there's one more thing that I want to briefly talk about, because it ties into what I'm going to talk about in the next video. So let's very quickly go back to Estolad, the place where all three houses of men eventually met. There's a really cool scene set here, where a council of men from all the different houses meet to debate their future plans and their relationship with the elves. And there are two important characters here, Bereg of the House of Beor and Amlach of the House of Hador. So, Bereg speaks first, and he's pretty skeptical of the elves. He's very critical of their endless war with Morgoth, and he suggests that men would be better off if they just moved completely away from the elves and left them to fight the Dark Lord on their own. Bereg says our lives are short enough. And to this, a few of the mannish elf friends, they do call him out, and they make the very valid point that from the Dark King come all the evils from which we fled, and that they'll never be free of him unless he is vanquished. They argue that the valor of the elves is the only way that could ever be achieved, and so it is the duty of men to help their elven allies in the wars against Morgoth. But then Amlach stands up, and Amlach takes things a step further. He basically states that the elves are lying to them, and that men are the victims of some great conspiracy. The sea has no shore, he says. There is no light in the west. And he goes on to even question whether Morgoth really is the true enemy. He says, "Who has beheld the Dark King? Those who seek the dominion of Middle-earth are the Eldar. Let the orcs have the realm that is theirs, and we will have ours." And Amlach's words cause a shadow of fear to fall on the hearts of all men who hear them. Many were convinced by him to abandon the elves and to just journey off into the south. But then something really, really chilling happens. So a few days later, Amlach comes back before the men of Estolad, but when the elf friends, again, call him out on what he said, he denies that he was ever there. Amlach never spoke before the Edain. And so it begins to dawn on the men of Estolad, and also on the reader, that they've all been deceived. A spy of Morgoth's was in their camp, in their council, and no one knew it. Some servant of the enemy had so convincingly walked amongst them in a form that the men all knew and trusted, that even the elf friends hadn't been aware of him. How do you fight an enemy with that much power? Now, Tolkien never tells us who this spy is, But if I had to guess, I think the safest speculation would be that it's Sauron. We know that Sauron is the Deceiver, we know that he can change his form at will, and we know that corrupting men is basically what he's all about. And I think this scene is just a really sobering reminder that although Morgoth has been besieged beneath Angband for hundreds of years, the Dark Lord has not been idle. Evil is ever present and ever growing. And so, in the next video, I'm going to talk all about what Morgoth's been up to and the many monstrous servants of shadow that he's been busily devising within the dungeons of Angband. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit the subscribe button and leave a like and a comment below if you enjoyed this video. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer mellyn.